Hello and welcome to lecture number 8. Today we'll explore the years after World War II in the state of Michigan. There are a few themes to be addressed in this presentation. First of all, when we look at Michigan's economy, it's characterized by periodic booms and busts. This is really true for all of the 20th century. What we'll also see is that after World War II there was great affluence. However, that was contrasted by economic crises, particularly at different times. We'll also explore some racial conflict and background to events surrounding the Detroit riots or revolution of 1967. Before we get into the presentation, I'd like to start with an idea put forth by Charlie Wilson. He was the president of General Motors from 1941 to 1953 and heavily involved in the organization for many years. He once made the statement, quote, "For years I thought what was good for our country was good for General Motors and vice versa." What I want to show here in this lecture kind of goes back to his ideas, and that's the fact that Michigan's economy was heavily influenced by the American economy. You can't just look at events in Michigan without the context of American history. So I'd like to begin by exploring the economic boom nationwide in the years after World War II, often referred to as the affluent society. American society was characterized by tremendous optimism in the years following the Second World War, and maybe it's best captured in this image. The day that the victory over Japan was announced, and this photo made its way to the cover of Life magazine, and it won many awards. In the years after World War II, the size of the middle class grew tremendously. In 1929, it was about 31% of the population. It had about doubled by 1955. And if a family of four had an income of between $3,000 and $10,000 a year, they were considered to be middle class. Today, those numbers would be adjusted for inflation, would be $25,000 to $85,000 a year. One of the factors that influenced this growth in the middle class was the passage of the GI Bill by Congress in 1944. This had a couple of main points. First of all, it provided full tuition and spending money for veterans of the Second World War. Secondly, it allowed for loan guarantees. A veteran could get a loan of up to $2,000 that was guaranteed. Basically, they would be able to get a loan for a car, for school, for a home, maybe to start a business. This produced a social revolution in the United States as the middle class grew dramatically. However, one of the unintended consequences of this was that the primary beneficiaries were white men. It wasn't designed to benefit white men only, but that was the impact that it had because most of the veterans were white and most of the veterans were male. Many of these members of the affluent society became new homeowners, and they wanted a little bit of extra space, and so many people built their new homes in the suburbs rather than inner cities. By the 1950s, about 20 million Americans moved from the cities to the suburbs. The image here shows a visual aid to help demonstrate this movement toward the suburbs. In 1940, about 19.5% of Americans lived in suburbs. This grew to over 30% by 1960. Although there was a great deal of affluence in the United States in the years after World War II, there was also an other America. In 1960, about 25% of the American people were living at or below the poverty level. Many of those individuals included homes headed by racial and ethnic minorities, as well as women. So this affluence was not widespread nationally. Now that we've looked at the affluent society in the United States, I'd like to focus more on Michigan and particularly the auto industry. The auto industry experienced tremendous prosperity in the years after World War II. and we see an advertisement for Ford Motor Company on the right. There had been a pent-up consumer demand because you literally could not buy a brand new car during the war because they weren't made. There are some statistics here on the number of vehicles produced. Beginning in World War II, the auto industry experienced a major boom. This was because of the wartime contracts, but this pent-up consumer demand really lasted for about 10 years after the war. Maybe a great symbol of this boom economy for the auto industry was seen with the Corvette, which first came out in 1953. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the phrase the big three. Well, those are the big three auto manufacturers in the United States: GM, Ford, and Chrysler. They dominated car production in the United States in the years after the war up until 2008. GM was the biggest. Each had their headquarters in the Detroit area. Most of the people who worked in the auto industry were members of the United Auto Workers Union. Next, I'd like to talk about a labor leader who influenced union contracts in the years after the Second World War. The image here shows Walter Reuther, an important labor leader and actually president of the United Auto Workers between 1946 and 1970. At times, he would work with administrators from the big three auto companies. For example, he did not allow any wildcat strikes during the Second World War, and he did not support them. However, when necessary, he also was willing to lead his union members toward a strike. Among other things, he successfully oversaw the negotiation of automatic raises based on inflation for UAW employees, as well as guaranteed retirement benefits. In the years after World War II, we saw an average increase in workers' salaries overall by 35%. And if you look at the chart on the right, you also see a major increase in the gross national product of all products that were produced in the United States. Reuther was not only an important labor organizer, he also linked the UAW with the Civil Rights Movement as well as the Democratic Party. Under the leadership of Walter Reuther, a kind of an unwritten agreement was developed between labor and management. If workers agreed to work hard, they would have a lifetime job with benefits and a pension. This became a pathway to the middle class for many workers in the United States. Next, we'll address the continued boom-bust nature of the auto industry. I wanted to revisit some of these population issues. On the left, you see the population of Detroit, which actually decreases between 1950 and 1960. On the right, you see the surrounding suburbs, where you see almost a doubling of the population. Most of the people who moved were actually white. Often this is referred to as white flight. The reason for this is that African Americans were largely confined to segregated neighborhoods in Detroit's inner cities. You're probably wondering, why did so many people move from the inner city to the suburbs? Well, there were a range of factors. First of all, if you look at the number of people who were employed in the auto industry, it actually dropped between 1953 and 1958. Some additional factors can help to explain this. First of all, there was the automation of the auto industry. They simply didn't need as many people on the assembly line as it became more automated. Also, during the Cold War, Michigan did not receive any defense contracts, and a lot of those new manufacturing jobs went to other states. And so people left the inner cities of Detroit and they moved to the suburbs or maybe even to neighboring states. So in the years after 1955, there were some lean years, some bad years where the economy was going bust, but there also continued to be boom years. Maybe some visual aids can help to explain this boom-bust cycle. On top, we see the Mustang, which was a great product produced by Ford beginning in 1964. Of course, down below, we see the Pinto. Maybe that can symbolize maybe not the best car that they produced in the last, 50 years or so. Really, from the 1960s onward, American auto companies began to lose market share. And you can see some examples of this with the graph on the right. Now, there were a range of factors that led to this, but one that I'd like to mention would be the impact of the price of gas. After conflict in the Middle East in the 1970s, the price of gas began to triple. In 1970, it was 35 cents a gallon. By 1979, it was $1. Now, before you say, gosh, I wish gasoline only cost $1 a gallon, in 2010, gasoline was $2.96 a gallon. If it tripled by today, it would be nearly $9 a gallon. So this tripling in the gas price had a major impact on the auto industry. So how did the price of gas impact auto sales? Well, many foreign competitors, particularly the Japanese and Europeans, ended up taking over market share because the big three auto manufacturers continued to produce large cars, while the Japanese in particular began to produce fuel-efficient cars that many Americans wanted. That boom-bust cycle with the auto industry continues to today. Now that we've explored Michigan's economy in the years after World War II, I'd like to address issues of race. I'd like to start with a little bit of background. Remember that affluent society that I was talking about earlier in the lecture, where the middle class just about doubled in size? Well, many African American families were excluded from this, and they did not join the middle class. Again, this is a little bit of review, but remember that GI Bill, the money for school and loans? This produced a social revolution. Well, why was it that white males were the primary beneficiaries? Well, colleges were legally segregated. Often access to education provides the ladder from going from a lower class to an upper class. Well, many African Americans were legally prohibited from going to many of these schools and taking advantage of the GI Bill. Again, another reminder, census data from 1960 showed that there was an other America. A quarter of the American people were living at or below the poverty level. Many of those included racial and ethnic minorities. Now that we've looked at some general statistics, I'd like to address conditions for Detroit's residents. If you were to explore unemployment rates for African Americans from 1960 onward, generally speaking, they are double than that for whites. A particular process also was used by many banks in the Detroit area, and this was called redlining. Essentially, if someone wanted to get a loan for a home, race often was used as a factor when determining a person's credit scores. African Americans had lower so-called credit ratings than whites. The result was that many blacks had difficulty securing loans except for homes in Detroit's segregated neighborhoods. No one is going to be expected to memorize these statistics, but I think that this can help to show some information. If you see the population in 1940, 90% of Detroit's residents were white. By 1960, this had dropped to 70%, 1970, 55, and by 1980, the city of Detroit became a majority black community. Now I'd like to address more specifically the conflict from 1967. In July of 1967, at an after-hours bar that was supposed to be closed, well, there were a group of African Americans who were celebrating the return of some Vietnam veterans. Well, the police raided the bar on that evening. This was the spark that started a conflict which lasted 5 days. Whites often refer to the events as a riot. African Americans often label it a rebellion. We see some images of the riots or rebellion here. Following decades of segregation, harassment, lack of opportunity, people rebelled in the African American community. The conflict itself lasted over 5 days. Over 40 people were killed and 1,000 were injured. 2,500 buildings were destroyed. Eventually, the U.S. Army was brought in, and there were $50 million in damages from these events. Here we see an aftermath of the riots or rebellion. It looked as if the city of Detroit was the middle of a war zone. A range of historians have attempted to offer an explanation as to why the riots or the rebellion took place. Essentially, there were long-term issues that had not been addressed, really beginning with discrimination that started in the years after the Civil War up until the 1960s, as many blacks faced Jim Crow laws, segregation in housing, and a lack of opportunity when it came to jobs. Whites, well, they simply left the inner city and they moved to the suburbs. African Americans were left in poverty with a lack of opportunity and a great deal of systemic abuse by the police. Well, the final topic I'd like to address would be the rebirth of the city of Detroit in many recent years. The image here shows the cover of Time magazine from 2009, as the nation's attention was geared toward the Motor City. Unemployment rates were high, the city had declared bankruptcy, poverty was widespread. It is important, however, to focus on Detroit because Detroit was and remains Michigan's largest and most important city. Again, I'd like to offer some statistics with these population figures. If you go back and you look at 1950, there were 1.8 million people living in the city of Detroit. By 2010, this figure was cut in half. In fact, more than in half. There were only about 700,000. 2008 and 2009 show a low point for the city of Detroit. However, that boom-bust economy has continued ever since then. Maybe this image helps to demonstrate the boom-bust cycle of Michigan's and Detroit's economy. We see a boom in the mid-2000s with SUV sales. I'm not sure if you're aware of this or not, but there's a huge profit margins, and this was really good for the big three. However, these sales went bust in many ways as jobs were outsourced to areas outside of the United States, particularly in Mexico. And then we had the 2008 financial crisis. Industry sales dropped dramatically, and General Motors was forced to declare bankruptcy. Although that boom-bust nature continued, what we do see in the years after the bankruptcy of General Motors is that the auto industry has rebounded after a government bailout in 2009. We've also seen a great deal of resurgence in downtown Detroit. On the left, we see the Fox Theater, which was originally opened in the 1920s, but it was renovated and reopened in 1988. We also see the MGM Grand Casino on the right. These provide entertainment for visitors. And going back to the late 1800s, Wayne State University, located in downtown Detroit, has continued to be a top-tier college. In addition to those examples, we see additional construction in downtown Detroit. Tiger Stadium was torn down and it was replaced with Comerica Park in 2000. The Lions moved from Pontiac, Michigan, back to Detroit with Ford Field in 2002. And then just recently, the former Joe Louis Arena was replaced with Little Caesars Arena Each of these sports stadiums, as well as the Fox Theater and MGM Grand, are located in downtown Detroit, and they demonstrate the resurgence of this important city. Well, there are a few things I'd like to review as we head to the end of this presentation. The focus of this presentation has been about Michigan's economy in the years after World War II. It was characterized by periodic booms and busts. Secondly, national issues had a major impact on events in the state of Michigan. You can't study any state's economy or society without looking at the national issues. Lastly, you should be able to identify many of the origins of the racial conflict which took place in 1967. There had been riots during the Second World War. There had been riots during the Civil War. These didn't just come out of the blue. Organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and the Black Legion had been around for years, and so you should be able to identify the origins of much of that racial conflict as well. Well, that's it for today. I hope you learned something new. Take care, and we'll see you soon.